Rising, Grand Rising. 10:41 in the AM, where I am, where I reside. It's been a while since I did the reading, and I've been really antsy about getting back to it. So, this is Race and Color in International Relations by Robert K.A. Gardiner. My disclaimer, I don't own the rights to this music, but it certainly is fitting for the reading. It's by Chill Hop, and it's something that I'm just listening to. The last time I started talking, I was talking about, or reading about the block system that had developed in the Race and Color in International Relations. So I'm going to start back right there. I'm going to put in I'm going to try to do 2 or 3 of them today in one session of my reading. The blocks operated as pressure groups or lobbying mechanisms for elections to the council and to committees of the league. A nominations committee was finally established in an attempt to cut down on lobbying and at the same time to meet the demands of the smaller nations, for whom bloc voting and lobbying had represented a certain democratic protection against the power and influence of their larger fellow members. This committee functioned only during the last 3 years of the League's existence. The block system was to come into its own again when the United Nations organization was created after World War II. The League's Permanent Mandates Commission was to have tremendous importance for the political development of colored peoples. The establishment of the mandate system, with its implicit guarantee of eventual self-determination and the explicit power of the League of Nations to intervene in the exercise of the mandate by the mandatory power, introduced a new concept into relations between the dominant white Westerners and the colored subject peoples. The decision of the International Court of Justice on the case of Southwest Africa is still topical, as is the subsequent resolution of the UN General Assembly revoking South Africa's mandate. With this exception, whenever a league mandate was created, the path to eventual independence, passing through the post-World War II freeway of the Trusteeship Council, has been clear and unimpeded. Thus, while the League was not precisely a major factor in the evolution of international relations during the 20-odd years that separated the 2 world wars, its influence in the area of dealings with dependent and mostly colored peoples was real and lasting. Churchill had perceived that within less than a year of the ending in Europe of World War II, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain had descended. Europe was no longer the center of the world, but rather a continent caught in the middle of a conflict between 2 non-European superpowers, Russia and the United States. The dwarfing of Europe was progressing on another level as well. the demographic, a process that had begun, according to some students, toward the end of the 19th century. Demography is not all. Although Europe still maintains the inherent advantages that its technological superiority conferred upon it, as is witnessed in the rapid recovery of Western Germany in the post-war years, this technology is no longer beyond the reach of non-European and non-Westernized countries. Russian, Japanese, and to a lesser extent, Communist Chinese examples demonstrate this. It is unlikely that the two-thirds of the world's population that inhabit Asia and Africa, given the advantage of modern technology and their clearly growing preoccupation with making that technology their own, will remain permanently enthralled to the less than 30% known as the West. The ideological clash that divides the world into East and West may, of course, be pursued to the point of the final Holocaust that nuclear warfare threatens. But for the purposes of this discussion, one must assume that mankind will spare itself this suicidal denouement and, predicting survival, try to assess realistically the probable significance of these new facts of the contemporary world. Demographers maintain, indeed, that for a considerable time to come, the rate of growth of the colored two-thirds of the world will be higher than that of the white minority. Whoa. My comment. Wow, see what I mean? They were talking about these things quite some time ago. There will very likely be, therefore, increasing pressure from the world's population, and particularly the colored population, on available land space. Probable pressure points and trouble spots are not difficult to pick out. As long ago as the beginning of this century, the White Australia policy was introduced to protect what one writer called a population less than the depleted population of Scotland against the congested millions of colored people just across the sea. Only recently has legislation been introduced in the United States to mitigate some of the effects of previous laws, the unequivocal purpose of which had been to limit severely the immigration of those same congested millions of colored people. About the same time that this legislation was being passed in the United States Congress, a socialist government in Britain was preoccupied with measures to control the immigration of colored people. The new states that have come into being since the end of World War II account for 1/4 of the world's population. Current estimates place the population of the new Asian states alone at 4 times that of the European Economic Community. Granted, the eventual acquisition of Western technology, a radical change has taken place in the world order. There are the beginnings, at least, of a shift of concern to what has been called the Third World, whose populations are largely non-white. It is a long way from the days when the yellow peril was the white man's bugbear. When fear of Oriental competition was couched in purely racial terms, the emergence of the new states has provided a new kind of political education for the older members of the international community, and the new states themselves have been learning many of the sobering realities of statehood. Above all, the competitions between the Third World and the old European world provide opportunities for bridging what may be described as the cultural gap between them. The very conventions and rituals of legal and diplomatic procedures serve to offer the scope needed for hammering out understanding and respect among nations. The new nations have in common their relative poverty, their underdevelopment. They all possess a technical and organizational capacity inadequate for exploiting their natural and human resources. One cannot strictly say, and let's pay attention to this part, I had it underlined. One cannot strictly say that they have their color in common. Yellow-skinned, black-skinned, or brown-skinned people. The bond they share is the fact that they are not white. This native similarity has become a strong rallying point for them simply because of the experience of recent centuries, when the white Westerner became increasingly conscious of himself as white and confidently assumed that his whiteness was a guarantee of his political, technical, and military preeminence. The non-white, non-Western peoples, overwhelmed by the superior efficiency of European technology, accepted at first the white man's estimates, not only of himself, but of themselves also. Later, disillusionment, disgust, and the renewed self-respect set in, and the white man's standards were vehemently rejected. At Bandung in 1955, Jawahar Nehru spoke of this reaction when he said, so this brother's name, I want to spell it to you. Jawahharlal, and his last name Nehru. So you can look him up. So at Bandung in 1955, this brother Jawaharlal Nehru spoke of this reaction when he said, has it come to this, that the leaders of thought who have given religion and all kinds of things to the world have to tag onto this kind of group or that and be hangers-on of this party or the other? It is an intolerable thought to me that the great countries of Asia and Africa shall have come out of bondage into freedom only to degrade themselves in this way. I will not tie myself to this degradation and become a camp follower of others. In Africa, the same motives have given rise to the concept of the African personality, which is both a rejection of westernization and a reassertion of the values and separate identity of Africa's own cultural heritage. These movements of rejection and of self-assertion have had, as was to be expected, political repercussions as well. Political repercussions. The most famous of these, the Bandung Conference of 1955, had its roots in the emergence of a fairly coherent Afro-Asian group at the United Nations during the Korean crisis of 1950. My comment. I've asked several people, do they know about the Bandung Conference? I've never heard anybody mention it, and most people that I mentioned it to said they've never heard of it. During the period immediately after World War II, the new nations gradually realized they had at least a number of negative reasons for making common cause in their international relations. President Sukarno said at Bandung, Sukarno, he said, this is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of the world. While there may be several interpretations of the significance of this fact, that it was a fact cannot be disputed. The road from Bandung led to Belgrade, where many of the Bandung nations discovered they could make common cause with nations neither Asian nor African nor colored. It also led in 1965 to the fruitless Algiers meeting, ruined by an ideological split in the communist world, by a geographical argument about who is and who is not Asian, and by China's dilemma of whether to opt for the mantle of the true heir of Marx and Lenin or for that of leader of the non-white world. Though there is some community of interest among the non-white states, it is not a hermetic one. It cannot be hermetic because each of its single components is a country with its own history, culture, and for the most part language. The meetings of new partners usually must be conducted in languages not their own, languages borrowed from or imposed by former Western rulers. The radical African leader may feel closer to and find it easier to make contact with a Parisian than a Darkartan. I hope I'm saying that right. Djakartan. Jakartan. One commenter suggests that for many participants, the Bandung Conference seems to have been attractive as an emotional herding together for mutual reassurance in a puzzling world. When even those nations best equipped in wealth and experience visibly flounder from crises to crises, it is not surprising that the new countries, uncertain of their direction, uncertain sometimes of the choices that may exist, should have tried to turn to one another for moral support and enlightenment. But coherent cooperation between sovereign countries must be based on more than urgent impulses. Nothing less than self-interest will do, or at least what is imagined to be self-interest, under whatever guise it may appear. And ideology is perhaps one of its most popular contemporary guises. A variety of impulses has then combined to produce meaningful alignments among the newly emerged nations, just as in post-war Europe a mixture of national motives produced the Rome Treaties of 1957. These new alignments, the Arab League is the oldest, the Organization of African Unity, the youngest, came into being as a result of economic or political economic imperatives. That regional groupings would and should exist has been explicitly recognized in two 20th century attempts to regulate the world order by international organizations. The Covenant of the League of Nations did not affect the validity of international engagement, such as treaties of arbitration or regional understanding for securing the maintenance of peace. Article 52 of the Charter of the United Nations makes very much the same provisions. The workings of what have been called the Caucasus within the United Nations constitute a separate study in themselves. One school of thought condemns the bloc or Caucasus system on the ground that it involves a complicated and sometimes unprincipled process of vote swapping, which frequently leads to issues being neither debated nor voted upon according to their real merits. Another school contends that in a large organization such as the United Nations, this kind of arrangement actually facilitates the process of negotiation and compromise, which is an unavoidable element in international relations once the possibility of coercion is removed. It can also be argued with some cogency that the presence of many such groups in an international organization could obviate any tendency toward excessively rigid divisions on major issues. Flexibility and real regard for the different nuances in any given question would thereby be increased, resulting in greater possibilities of solution or compromise. This is a very significant thought, which, logically extended, may be helpful in examining some of the directions international relations may take in the future. In the context of the post-war world, one of the most striking multinational groupings is the Commonwealth of Nations, starting life under the aegis of the Westminster Statute of 1931 as a loose association of Anglo-Saxon states, individually called dominions, but collectively retaining the style of empire. This group now boasts an embryonic full-time secretariat headed by an American from Canada and an African from Ghana. The turning point for the British Commonwealth came in 1947 when the former imperial domain of India became the two independent states of India and Pakistan. Strains on the imperial concept, thought of a significantly different sort, had, however, already begun to be felt in the first decades of this century. In the process of growing into their own sovereign personalities, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, once the purest of imperial outposts, had learned that the essential problems of their independence could no longer be regulated from London, that the demographic pressures of the Far East and the geopolitical realities of life for an independent state in the Pacific were not European, that they must, on balance, be more sensitive to what was happening in the White House than to what was happening in Whitehall. Thus, the Commonwealth was one of the first political entities to reflect the weakening of European hegemony. When independence was granted to India and Pakistan, a new era decisively began. How new was even then not clearly visible. How new was even then not clearly visible. The lessons of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada had not been interpreted as pointing to an ultimate breakup of the Commonwealth. A Labour member of Parliament, Mr. Patrick Gordon Walker, said in 1947 that while Mr. Churchill might throw away the empire, as George III had done with the American colonies, the Labour government's aim was to save it by giving the colonies self-government. If this plan comes off, the empire will be a very powerful idea indeed. Mr. Gordon Walker's idea was one of a multiracial community of free nations. In this sense, the British Commonwealth represents an experiment of capital importance for mankind, crowded together as it is on one planet. The independence of Pakistan and India offered equality from that which the white dominions had enjoyed up to that time. These countries were not tied to Britain by bonds of race. How was it then that despite the geopolitical pressures, despite the lack of racial affinity, these countries opted to remain in association with the former imperial power? The answer is complex and possibly not fully known, though self-interest obviously played a role in this development. The post-war Commonwealth has proved again that race is not the indispensable cement of international grouping. It has proved this positively by the adherence of India and other republics. Plus, one independent federation, Malaysia. The 1965 war between India and Pakistan is negative proof of the fragility of racial bonds. While the Commonwealth was fumbling along on its pragmatic path, theorists in continental Europe were at work. Imagine, they said to themselves, if 220 million Africans and 200 million Europeans could get together into an economic unit. With Europe's skills and techniques and Africa's raw materials, one could create potentially the most powerful single bloc in the world. The origins of the Eurafrica concept go back some 40 years. Vernon Mackay cites a book published in 1933 by a French writer, Eugene Grenier, entitled L'Afrique, Champ d'Expansion l'Europe. This work argues that a longitudinal view of politics would make of Europe and Africa after the immigration of 15 to 20 million Europeans into Africa, one of these intercontinental units. Germany, too, got into the act. One German publicist cited by Mackay called in 1952 for a strong Franco-German nucleus of a European community, without Britain, for the common exploitation of African resources. Europeanists in the United States seemed to subscribe to this idea on the assumption that Latin America was the special responsibility of the United States, and that Africa should be a special sphere of interest for Europe. Several versions of this concept became current after World War II. They all had one thing in common. Europe came first, Africa second. Africa was to be Europe's dowry, a means of redressing Europe's losses without the burdens of the colonial relationships. Strategic considerations also came into play. Africa is the natural complement of and is vital to the defense, life, and subsistence of Europe, wrote a French commentator in 1957. Well, my people, Race and Color and International Relations by Robert K.A. Gardiner. I don't add to or take from. I'm reading it exactly how he wrote it. And this is telling me the truth about everything that has built this quilt that they put together in these affairs. So when I come back, I'll be start talking about the French community inaugurated under President de Gaulle's Fifth Republic and buttressed by the association of former French dependencies with the European Common Market provided a combination of the ideas of Eurafrica with the basic assumption of the British Commonwealth. So I'll start right there. I'll be back sooner than you think.